couldn't really accept that or understand it. And then all of a sudden I was numb. I never understood what it was to physically feel numb. But that day I was like, I literally don't feel my body. And then the first thing I'm thinking is like,
over 5 years, and then cheated on her, dumped her, and then now she is broke and damn near about to be evicted? I'm confused.
Y'all, this didn't just escalate. This situation completely collapsed overnight, because what started as quiet rumors about Kandi Burruss and her broken marriage has now turned into something way darker, way more personal, and honestly, way more disturbing than anyone expected. At first, people thought the divorce was just about an affair. Messy, yes. Shocking, maybe. But still, something we've seen before, until now. Because insiders are claiming that behind all the silence, behind all the "we're moving on" energy, there was a secret building that nobody saw coming, an anonymous report, no name, no source, just one claim that changed everything, that Angela Simmons is allegedly pregnant. And not just pregnant, but carrying Todd Tucker's baby. Yeah, let that sink in. Because suddenly, this isn't just betrayal anymore. This is overlap. This is timing that doesn't make sense. This is a story that was already unfolding while everyone was still pretending things were fine. And here's where it gets even worse. Because sources say when Kandi found out, she didn't just react, she collapsed, went live, visibly shaking, voice breaking, trying to hold it together while everything around her was falling apart in real time. And the internet caught every second of it. Now people are asking questions that nobody can answer. Was she the last to know? Was this already happening before the divorce? And if this pregnancy is real, then how long has this secret actually been growing behind closed doors?
We saw he gave you some flowers.
yeah, they were really nice.
Y'all not together or nothing?
No.
He shot his shot though.
He's a nice guy, and
Yeah.
I'm flattered by everything, but we're not.
What makes this situation unsettling isn't just the allegation, it's the timing. Because when people started lining up the sequence of events surrounding Kandi Burruss's divorce, something didn't sit right. The gap between what was public and what was allegedly happening behind the scenes felt too narrow. At first, it was framed as a standard fallout, a marriage strained, an alleged affair, a decision to walk away. Clean. Understandable. Contained. But that version didn't last long, because insiders began pointing to something else entirely. Not a sudden mistake, but a pattern that had been building quietly. Subtle changes in behavior, unexplained absences, conversations that felt controlled, the kind of signs that don't confirm anything on their own, but start to connect when placed side by side. And then came the detail that shifted everything. An anonymous report. No verified source, no direct confirmation, just a claim that immediately reframed the entire narrative. That Angela Simmons is allegedly pregnant, and that the child is connected to Todd Tucker. That's the point where this stops looking like a breakup and starts looking like overlap. Because if that claim holds any weight, even partially, it suggests something was already in motion before anything officially ended. And that raises a question no one has answered clearly. When did this actually begin? Because timelines matter. And right now, the timeline is where the story starts to fracture. Moments that once seemed separate are now being re-examined as connected. Public appearances, periods of silence, sudden shifts in energy that didn't have explanations at the time. Now they do, or at least they appear to.
Let me just say, no matter what Todd and I are going through, we are parents together. We are co-parenting together. We have beautiful children together. So we are trying to make this transition as smooth as it can possibly be.
There are clips being revisited, interviews where tone changes mid-sentence, interactions that feel slightly off when viewed in hindsight. Nothing definitive, nothing that proves anything directly, but enough to create a pattern, and patterns don't form without repetition. That's what's making this harder to ignore. Because it's not one incident, it's a sequence, a series of small details that, when placed together, start pointing in the same direction. Behind the scenes, sources describe environments where boundaries blurred, private spaces, controlled settings. Places where relationships could evolve without immediate scrutiny. If that's accurate, then this didn't happen suddenly. It developed quietly, gradually, and by the time it became visible, it was already established, which brings everything back to Kandi, because reports suggest she didn't uncover this in pieces. She saw it all at once. Connections, timing, context, the kind of realization that forces everything to be reinterpreted instantly. And the reaction, according to multiple accounts, was immediate, not calculated, not filtered. awkward, emotional, a public moment that wasn't planned but couldn't be contained either, a live appearance that showed something different from the composed image people were used to seeing, a shift from control to collapse. And once that moment went public, the narrative changed again. Because now it wasn't just about what happened, it was about how long it had been happening. At the same time, another layer began surfacing. Mentions of Yo Gotti entering the conversation, not as a central figure, but as part of the surrounding timeline. Questions about whether there were overlapping suspicions on multiple sides, whether distance in one relationship was connected to awareness of another. No confirmation, no direct statements tying everything together. But again, the pattern. And that's what keeps this from settling. Because every time it starts to look like a simple story, another detail appears that complicates it, another connection that doesn't quite fit the original version. So now the focus shifts again, not just on what is being claimed, but on what hasn't been explained. If this was truly a clean break followed by a new beginning, why do the timelines feel compressed? Why do the reactions feel delayed? And why does every new piece of information seem to point backward instead of forward? Because if the sequence is accurate, then this didn't start after everything ended. It started before anyone realized something was wrong, and if that's the case, then the version of events people believed at the beginning was never the full story to begin with.
I am up and down. Obviously, going through a divorce is definitely not the easiest thing. You know, sometimes, you're cool, you know what I mean? You move in, you mix in, you move in, and you're hanging out with friends. But then sometimes you have your moments of sadness.
The more this unfolds, the less it looks like a sudden collapse. And the more it resembles something that was already in motion long before anyone noticed. Because once the alleged pregnancy detail entered the conversation, the focus shifted from what happened to when it actually started. And that's where the narrative becomes harder to contain. People began revisiting moments that didn't stand out before. Subtle absences, missed appearances, gaps in timelines that were never explained. At the time, they meant nothing. Now, they are being treated as markers. And when those markers are placed next to each other, they form a sequence that keeps pointing back to the same two names, Todd Tucker and Angela Simmons, not as a new development, but as an ongoing one. That distinction matters, because if this was ongoing, then it existed alongside something else, alongside a marriage that publicly still appeared intact, alongside another relationship that hadn't officially ended. That's where the idea of a double timeline starts to emerge. One timeline that people saw, another that was unfolding quietly. Sources describe environments where both timelines could exist without immediate collision. Private gatherings, industry spaces with limited visibility, controlled interactions where nothing is recorded unless someone wants it to be. In those settings, proximity becomes routine, familiarity builds, and eventually boundaries shift without announcement. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just gradual change, and gradual change is harder to detect. That's why the reaction when everything surfaced felt abrupt, because from the outside, it looked like everything changed overnight, but from the inside, it may have been changing for months. That contrast is what's driving the current speculation, because now the attention isn't just on what was revealed, it's on what was hidden.
They said threesomes never work. That's not true. I done had a threesome and it worked just fine. It worked great, actually. Anyway, I feel like it's the communication.
Little pussy's just hot. You did.
What are you talking about? I'm just saying it's the communication on it all. But I think
there are moments being analyzed frame by frame, short clips, public interactions, small details that once seemed insignificant. A pause before answering a question, a shift in tone when certain topics come up, eye contact that breaks too quickly. None of it proves anything directly, but together it creates tension, and tension leads to interpretation. At the same time, another thread continues to surface. Yo Gotti, not as confirmation of anything specific, but as part of a broader pattern. Because if there were suspicions on his side as well, that suggests awareness existed before any public acknowledgement, and awareness changes behavior. It explains distance.
Everything else we've done together.
right, which I thought we was always doing something together, and then you tried to cut me out.
I create a lot of things that I don't care that I don't get credit for.
Okay.
Anything I create, oh, Kandi, da da da.
So you
I do not really some weird words.
but that's the way it feels.
It explains silence. It explains why certain reactions appear delayed instead of immediate. According to some accounts, that delay wasn't hesitation, it was calculation, waiting to confirm what couldn't yet be proven, watching a situation unfold without confronting it directly. That approach doesn't stop the outcome. It only postpones it, and when the outcome finally arrives, it doesn't arrive gently, it arrives all at once. Which brings the focus back to the alleged report that triggered everything, because without that report the pattern might have remained unnoticed, without that single claim the timelines might never have been questioned, and without those questions the public version of events would have remained intact, but now that version is unstable, because every new detail seems to reinforce the same possibility, that multiple relationships were shifting at the same time, in the same direction, without immediate disclosure. That's not a coincidence people are comfortable accepting. It suggests alignment. Not necessarily intention, but alignment. And alignment raises its own set of questions. Who recognized the pattern first? Who chose not to act on it immediately? And who benefited from the delay? Because timing is no longer a background detail, it's the central issue. If the alleged pregnancy is part of that timeline, then it didn't happen after everything ended, it developed while everything was still in place. And if that's accurate, then the collapse people witnessed wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment the hidden timeline finally collided with the visible one, leaving only one question that still hasn't been answered clearly. How much of this was already known all before anyone said a word? What makes the final phase of this story difficult to ignore isn't the allegation itself, it's how everything aligns once the emotional reaction is placed back into the timeline. Because when Kandi Burruss appeared live, that moment didn't feel like confusion. It felt like confirmation. Not of a single detail, but of a pattern she may have already been trying to piece together. The tone, the hesitation, the visible strain in her voice, none of it suggested surprise, it suggested realization, and realization changes how every prior moment is interpreted, because if that reaction came from connecting multiple pieces at once, then those pieces had to exist before that moment, which brings the focus back to the alleged pregnancy claim involving Angela Simmons and Todd Tucker, not as a standalone rumor, but as the final piece that made everything else make sense. If that claim is even partially accurate, then it introduces a fixed point in the timeline, a point that cannot be easily shifted or re-explained, because a development like that doesn't happen instantly. It requires time, and time is exactly what complicates this entire sequence. Because now every earlier moment has to be measured against that timeline. Every appearance, every period of silence, every instance where something felt slightly off. Placed individually, they don't confirm anything. Placed together, they begin to suggest continuity. That's the difference. And that difference is what keeps this from settling into a simple narrative. There are also questions around behavior that surfaced only after everything became public. Why did certain responses feel delayed? Why did confirmations come only after speculation had already spread? Why did no one directly address the timeline itself? These are not definitive indicators of anything specific, but they create gaps, and gaps invite interpretation. Another factor that continues to complicate the story is the repeated mention of parallel dynamics, the idea that more than one relationship was shifting simultaneously, that distance in one space may have been connected to developments in another. Yo Gotti remains part of that discussion, not because of direct confirmation, but because of timing. If suspicions existed there as well, it suggests that awareness was not isolated. It suggests multiple people may have been noticing changes at the same time, without immediate confrontation. That kind of awareness doesn't produce immediate outcomes, it builds pressure. And pressure, when it isn't released early, tends to surface all at once, which is what the public appears to have witnessed. Not the start of a breakdown, but the end of a buildup. And that distinction matters, because it reframes everything that came before. What looked like stability may have been uncertainty. What looked like confidence may have been restraint. What looked like normal interaction may have been something more controlled. If that's the case, then the visible version of events was never fully aligned with the underlying reality. It was only a partial view. And now that partial view is being replaced with something more complex, not confirmed, not fully explained, but increasingly difficult to dismiss, because each new detail doesn't resolve the story, it extends it. It adds another layer that has to be accounted for. Another question that doesn't have a clear answer. Was the timeline misunderstood from the beginning? Or was it intentionally left unclear? Was the emotional reaction a response to a single discovery? Or to the realization of how long everything had been unfolding? And perhaps the most persistent question, if the alleged pregnancy marks a point that cannot be moved, then how far back does everything else actually go? Because if that point sits earlier than expected, then the story people believed at the start wasn't just incomplete, it was already behind the truth. And just when it looks like every piece is finally on the table, the story still refuses to close. Because this isn't a clean ending. This is a collision of timelines that were never supposed to be exposed at the same time. What people are reacting to now isn't just the allegation. It's the realization that too many things were happening in parallel without being acknowledged. Too many silences, too many delayed reactions, too many moments that only make sense after the damage is already done. And the most unsettling part? No one is stepping forward with a clear, direct timeline to shut it all down. That absence matters, because in situations like this, clarity usually comes fast if the narrative is simple. But here, every answer seems to open another gap. Every explanation feels partial. Every response arrives just late enough to raise more questions than it resolves, which keeps the focus locked on one possibility people can't ignore. This didn't start when it became public. It started long before. And if that's true, then what the audience witnessed wasn't the beginning of the fallout. It was the moment everything hidden finally surfaced at once. Now the pressure shifts, not just on what is being said, but on what still hasn't been addressed. Because if even one part of this alleged timeline is accurate, then the rest of the story is still incomplete. And incomplete stories don't stay quiet. They unravel. So the real question isn't whether more details will come out. It's how much of this has already happened that no one has admitted yet.